This audio is brought to you by Muslim Central. Please consider donating to help cover our running costs and future projects by visiting www.muslimcentral.com/donate.
You're listening to Qalam Institute's podcast. Visit us on the web at qalaminstitute.org and join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Qalam Institute.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing with our series on the Seerah, the prophetic biography, the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inshallah, today's session, the last two sessions have been committed to an introduction to the Seerah. And the primary focus of those sessions was why study the Seerah, and subsequently what are the benefits of studying the life of the Prophet ﷺ in intricate detail. Today's session, again, will not be what's typically expected within a Seerah lecture, just simply because we have to have the complete picture. If we are to really understand, if we are to study the Seerah, if we're to understand and extract practical benefits and lessons from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, then one very important detail is understanding the circumstances at his time, understanding the situation that existed at that time. Because unless and until you don't understand the circumstances, the situations that were present at that time, then you don't have a full appreciation for who the Prophet ﷺ was, what he was able to accomplish, and the lasting legacy that he left behind. There's a famous couplet, I believe in Persian, I don't know it in actual Persian off the top of my head, but it roughly translates to the fact that you can only appreciate the beauty of roses when it's present amongst thorns. That the rose truly shows its beauty when it sits amongst thorns. And so the life of the Prophet ﷺ is such a miracle in and of itself. His life, the way he lived his life, and the change that he was able to cause and enact. And that can only truly be understood and appreciated once you fully comprehend the circumstances, the situations that were present at the time of his life. So today's session will solely be dedicated to understanding Arabia, pre-Islamic Arabia. What was that situation? So we'll start off with a very basic detail, and this is from the tradition, again, of scholarship, that this is the way that traditional scholarship, classical scholarship goes about in discussing these topics. That first of all, we know that that land, those people, that even to a certain extent, that time, that culture is referred to as Arab. Alright, that is the word for the people, that is the word for the place, and that is the word of the name of the culture. So what does Arab itself mean? So there's a lot of different opinions when you look within the lexicon, but something very interesting, and this also is part of the reason why the Prophet ﷺ was sent amongst these people. Understanding who these people were, what their situation was, and what they were capable of, both good and bad, also answers the question, the philosophical question, why was Muhammad ﷺ sent amongst these people? Why was the Qur'an revealed in this language? Why was the Qur'an revealed amongst these people? So the word Arab itself, when you get down to the etymology of the word and the root of the word, again, there's a difference of opinion, there's a variety of opinions, but one of the most basic understandings of this word in its absolute root is that it refers to something that flows. Something that runs and something that flows. And based on that, there were different basic usages of this word within the Arabic language. To speak clearly, clarity in speech. The word Arab would refer to clarity in speech, and that's part of why the Arab called themselves Arab, because they believed that they spoke clearly. And typically we know, what do the Arabs call non-Arabs? What do they call them? Ajam. They call them Ajam. And typically we understand that the meaning of the word Ajam is somebody who doesn't speak, somebody who's mute. Not correct. The meaning of the word Ajam is somebody, sure, they have it doesn't mean mute, like they don't have the physical ability to speak. It means somebody who definitely has a physical ability to speak, but when that person speaks, they babble. They talk nonsense, they talk gibberish. So Ajam literally means someone who babbles, somebody who speaks gibberish. And Arab means somebody who speaks clearly. So again, it's extracted from that because they believe that their speech was superior because it flowed and it ran like no other language or no other form of speech. So that's why their language was called that. And based on that, they would say, the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith, the word Arab itself is never used within the Qur'an. The word Arab itself is never used within the Qur'an in that form. Different forms of the word are used. Like Arabi, Arabiyun. Qur'an is described as Arabiyun. Alright? So the word Arabi is used, which is an extraction of that word Arab, which means something that is Arab. So the Qur'an is something that is Arab, meaning it's in the Arabic language. Alright? So, but the Prophet ﷺ, he uses this word in this meaning of flowing speech, or to be very clear in one's speech, to clearly articulate. Where the Prophet ﷺ says, الثَّيِّبُ يُعْرَبُ عَنْهَا لِسَانُهَا. When talking about the technicalities, the fiqh of marriage, we all know that in the fiqh of marriage, in nikah, that when an unmarried, a single woman, a woman who's never been married before, when she is getting married, then at that time, she requires the permission and representation of her wali, her male guardian. But the Prophet ﷺ says, الثَّيِّب, that a woman that has been married previously, now she is either a widow or a divorcee, the Prophet ﷺ says, يُعْرَبُ عَنْهَا لِسَانُهَا, that her own tongue will speak on her behalf. Meaning she is now allowed to represent herself in her own marriage ceremony and in the marriage proceedings. So the Prophet ﷺ is using this word yu'rabu, which comes from the word Arab, to be very clear, to clearly articulate. Similarly, the Arabs would use the word Arab. Also, before I go forward, the Arabs had an expression, they would call somebody Arbaniyul Lisan. Arabaniyul Lisan would mean somebody who speaks very clearly. Similarly, the second meaning that the word in which the Arabs would use the word Arab is for happiness, or for something to be emotionally fulfilling. This is used in the Qur'an in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls the companions of paradise, the companions of Jannah, Allah refers to them as فَجَعَلْنَاهُنَّ أَبْكَارًا فَجَعَلْنَاهُنَّ أَبْكَارًا عُرُوبًا أَتْرَابًا. Uruban. So Allah refers to the companions of paradise, the companions of Jannah, as urub. Urub literally means somebody who's very loyal, somebody who's very loving, a passionate lover is called urub. That's the plural, arub. So that's the word for somebody who is very passionate in their love for someone. So again, very emotionally fulfilling, that this person's emotions, they run and they flow like the river flows. So much so that even when a river would overflow, they would use the word araba. Nahrun arabatun, this river is overflowing. Bi'run arabatun, a well that is overflowing. And so much so that, and this is very interesting, when something would become chaotic, when something would become problematic, when something would lose order, the word Arab would also be used for that. So the Arabs would say, Arabat mi'adatuhu. If somebody had an upset stomach, somebody had indigestion, they would say, Arabat mi'adatuhu, that he has indigestion. They would use the word Arab. Why? Because like when the river flows, when a stream runs, when a river flows, that water, while it's flowing and it's beautiful, but at the same time, it's not organized, is it? It's very chaotic. It's water. It flows in all different directions, and it goes around the rocks in the middle of the stream, and all types of stuff is going on there. So it's a very beautiful, controlled chaos, if you will. And that's the root meaning of the word Arab itself. And something now very interesting about that is, that to a great extent describes these people. That's why these people were called the Arab. All of these qualities and characteristics described what these people were like. They were very clear in their speech. They were very articulate in their speech, in their language. In fact, it could even be argued that they were the most articulate people when it came to speech and language. Secondly, they were very passionate people. Something that I'll be talking about as long as time permits a little bit later in today's lesson is talking about some of the good qualities that the Arabs had. Because too often when we talk about pre-Islamic Arabia, we talk about all the bad that was rampant. But we don't talk about the good that was prevalent. And something that's very interesting is that the Arabs had a great admiration for the qualities that we call hilm, forbearance, to have composure, to be very to be very calm and peaceful, to be very serene. They had great admiration for these qualities. Part of the reason was these qualities were very rare amongst the Arabs, because they were so passionate. They were such a passionate people that oftentimes they had trouble containing their own emotions. So again, that quality of passion was found amongst these people. And lastly, the chaos. That these were also people that were largely chaotic. There was not an established form of governance. There was not a systematic form of economics. There was not even a centralized form of religion for these people. So some of the primary factors that unite people, that organize people, whether it's government or it's economics, all right, financial interest, or it's religion. These are often the things that organize people. None of these things were organized amongst the Arabs. And that led to a lot of the chaos that we find there in pre-Islamic Arabia. And it was first the religion which brought about a system of governance, which established an economic system, which all came after Islam. These were the contributions of Islam to these people, which contributed to the organization of these people, and how these people became the exemplary civilization of their time. So that's a very interesting contrast, which we'll discuss later on. Now to talk about the history of the Arabs, and this is something I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. There's a lot of detail in this. Ibn Kathir rahimahullah talks about this for maybe about 100 plus pages. In classical Arabic, he delves into the history of the Arabs. While there's a lot of very interesting things that we can find there, but like I said, part of the focus of these sessions will be to make the life of the Prophet ﷺ, to basically to engage in a very practical, relevant study of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And so obviously, delving into very, very deep details of the history of the Arabs, the genealogy of the Arabs, is something that might not be prudent to the common average Muslim, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. I would like, however, for you to just simply understand that genealogists, they divide the history of the Arabs, they divide the Arab race into two primary categories. So first of all, this is a sub-ethnic category, and then it's divided into two major categories. First are the ancient Arabs, or the perished Arabs, if you will. Those were the Arabs of Ad and Thamud. And those were the Arabs who largely perished. Not a lot remains of them, and not a lot is known of them outside of, again, the religious tradition that we have. All right? So that's the first category. The second category are the Arabs who remained. The Arabs who remained. And these are also known as the migrated Arabs. Some of them also, some genealogists also refer to them as the migrated Arabs. The reason why these are also called the migrated Arabs is because we find them primarily, or at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it seems like the epicenter was the Arabian Peninsula, when in reality, these people that we see as Arabs at that time were not originally from that area. They had migrated to that area from other regions. So these were the Arabs who remained, all right? That's the second category. Amongst the Arabs who remained, there were two categories as well. There were two subcategories. First were referred to as the pure Arabs. The pure Arabs. The pure Arabs were primarily what I will refer to, in even classical times, that region was called the same name, Yemen. What we know as current day, modern day Yemen, and even in ancient times and classical times, that region of the world was still referred to as Yemen. Alright, they were basically the Yemeni Arabs. That they had come to the Arabian Peninsula, Hijaz specifically, within the Arabian Peninsula. They had migrated there from the area of Yemen, and there's even a history to that. The Quran makes reference to Sayl al-Aram, alright, that there was a great flood in the area of Yemen, and due to that great flood, there's actually a little bit of detail there. Some Arabs had actually migrated to Hijaz even before the flood. Even before the flood, due to economic hardship. There were basically two major tribes. One of them had taken control of the economy of the area. The second tribe, due to falling behind economically, they decided to pack their bags and move to a new place to try to find a better future for themselves and their children. And these were the first group of immigrants, and then the second group followed after the flood. Alright, so these were the pure Arabs. The second group, the second subcategory are the Arabized Arab, alright, the Al-Musta'arabun. the Arabized Arabs, the ones who became Arab. And the primary of these categories were Ismail alayhi salam himself. He falls amongst this category. That's somebody who was not Arab ethnically, but was Arabized, became Arab. Alright, and this constituted for a large population. And the world as we see it today, what we know as the Arab world today, the vast majority of it falls under this category of the Arabized Arabs, because as Islam spread, the Arabic language and the Arab culture also spread along with it. And so much of what we know as the Arab world today is actually the Arabized world. Alright? So this is the history of these people who are known as the Arabs, amongst whom the Prophet ﷺ was born. And so why is this of such prudent detail? Because the Prophet ﷺ comes from the progeny of the Arabized Arabs. The Prophet ﷺ comes from the progeny of the Arabized Arabs. And that's very important to remember. Alright? Now, the geography. And again, the purpose of these lessons is not to teach you geography, but to give you an understanding of why the circumstances existed that did. Alright? The Arabian Peninsula is a very interesting place. If you just try to take a quick image, if you can try to draw a quick map in your head, then you can take a look at it clockwise, if you will, that the Arabian Peninsula is almost from the northeast all the way around to the mid to northwestern region is completely surrounded by water. That's why it's called a peninsula. Alright, so it starts off at the northeast with the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman on the east, the Arabian Sea, which is an extension of the Indian Ocean on the south and the southeast, the Gulf of Aden continues on to the south, and then finally you have the Bab al-Mandab Strait on the southwest, and the Red Sea up to the western regions of the Arabian Peninsula. So you literally have it completely surrounded by water. Alright, now the northern region of the Arabian Peninsula borders classically what was known as Bilad al-Sham, the ancient regions of Syria, the ancient areas of Sham. Alright, and even till today the Syrian desert is what borders the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And this is how it's structured geographically. Now, what can we learn based from that? What we can learn from that is there were two very interesting features to the geographical location of the Arabian Peninsula. Number one, it was very, if you will, internal. It was very internal. From a land perspective, it was very internal. So you only had one entrance to the land. Land-wise, you only had one entrance into the Arabian Peninsula, and that was through the Syrian desert, which, as you can probably understand, was not exactly a walk in the park. You would literally have to travel through, hundreds of thousands of miles, hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles, of desert region. Severe desert. Alright, so due to that, it was no walk in the park. So it had a very internal setting which left it very isolated from many outside influences in terms of language, in terms of culture, and even religion, and many different factors. Which meant that it was a very insulated experience. The experience of being from the Arabian Peninsula, from being from Hijaz, was a very insulated experience. You were cushioned, you were insulated from many external factors and influences. So that meant it was a hotbed of deep cultural tradition. Alright, and it was a treasure of linguistic nuances, literary nuances. So it had a very deep culture, a very deep language, and that was the experience there. The second part of it was that it was also at the same time a very external region. It was a very exposed region of the world. Now, what do I mean by it being very exposed? That it was very exposed in terms of sea and ocean. So it served as a primary port to many key trade routes and traveling routes to very strategic parts of the world. What that basically again means is that at the same time it became an epicenter of trade and business. It became an epicenter of trade and business, that it was a very key strategic location in terms of trade and business. So you had these two interesting dynamics to the Arabian Peninsula, to Hijaz, where it had a very deep culture, a very deep language, was not influenced by foreign influences, and there was not a lot of government interest either. And in fact, implanting a government or running your own government from externally would be a very difficult endeavor. Would be nearly impossible, because you'd be completely cut off from this arm of your government that extended within this region. And that's why you did not have a lot of foreign invasions. Alright? But at the same time, in terms of trade and business, it was a very key strategic region, which gave these people, again, a very strategic positioning. Alright? These people were in a very, very interesting place in terms of business and trade and finance and economics. Now, the political situation. What were the political circumstances revolving around this area of the world, this region? At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, again, there's a lot of history here, but we're going to focus on at the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, or even you can call it at the advent of Islam, at the revelation of the Quran, prophethood, the initiation of prophethood. What were the political circumstances that existed around this region? So you have a few regions, a few parts of the world that bordered the Arabian Peninsula, Hijaz. First of all, the primary amongst them is of course Yemen. Now Yemen, very interestingly, had been a battling ground, had been a war zone between the Jews and the Christians for a very long time. Yemen was one of those very few places amongst the ancient Arab world where Judaism had taken root. Judaism had found a home within Yemen. And for a very long time, for hundreds of years, Judaism and Christianity had been at war within Yemen. Judaism itself was rooted within Yemen, and you had the nearby neighboring region of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, Eastern Africa, which was predominantly Christian, which had a Christian empire. Alright? And these two religions had been at war within Yemen for a very long time, and they had fought over the leadership, the rulership, the kingship of Yemen for a very, very long time. And we know that the Christian kingdom, in fact, in Abyssinia, had played a foreign influence. They had backed the Christians within Yemen for a very long time in terms of that war. Close to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Abyssinians had literally come in and taken over. They had just come in and straight up taken over the area of Yemen. And from there you have the incident of the elephants, alright, the invasion of the elephants and Abraha. You have that entire situation which we'll talk about in coming sessions, inshallah. So you have that dynamic going on there. However, closer to the time of prophethood, so during the early years of the Prophet ﷺ, somewhere during that time, there was an uprising. There was a Persian influence that came into Yemen, and that backed some of the Jews and some of the local Arab tribes of Yemen, the polytheists, the idolatrous tribes of Yemen, the mushrikun of Yemen. They backed them from the Persian Empire, and they were able to overthrow the Christian Abyssinian kingdom, the rulership that was present in Yemen. And because of that, the Persian rule basically came into power. And the local tribes were the ones that were put into power, but it was attributed back to the Persian Empire. So for all intents and purposes, it was considered as an extension of the Persian Empire. However, the last of the Persian rulers, Badhan, he himself accepted Islam during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, and Yemen basically entered into Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ himself, he sent Ali bin Abi Talib and Muaz bin Jabal radiallahu anhuma to the area of Yemen to go there and to teach and to spread Islam amongst the people of Yemen. And so while Yemen had a very interesting history, during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, during the prophethood, during his lifetime, Yemen actually entered into Islam. So this was the primary region. The second region which bordered or was near enough to be an influence on ancient Arabia was Hira. Was the ancient classical region of Hira. Now Hira is what we know as current day, modern day Iraq, basically, parts of Iraq. Alright, the southern parts of Iraq was what was classically referred to as Hira. Now, in that area, again, there was always primarily a Persian influence. And that Persian influence remained there throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Only after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, during the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, were the locals And what I refer to by the locals is the local Arab tribes. So for a very long time it was a Persian influence. Only into the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab were the local Arab tribes able to take over power and regain their region for themselves. But literally they were in power for not even an entire year until Khalid ibn al-Walid at the helm of a Muslim army came in and overtook that region, and that region came under the rule of Islam as well. Another neighboring region for the for the ancient Arabs at that time, the Arabian Peninsula, at that time from the north was of course what we refer to as Syria, but it's the classical ancient region of Bilad al-Sham. Syria primarily was a Christian influenced region. Down from Rome there was a very heavily Christian influence within Syria, and that also affected the northern regions of even the Arabian Peninsula, which were also primarily Christian at that time. And of course this Christian influence within that northern region of Syria lasted until the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, until that region also came into Islam. Now, these are the political influences. Now I know that I keep making a lot of reference to the religion of the area. That's only for the reason that we're talking about a time where there was a synchronization between religion and governance and rulership. That these kings were not just kings of they were not just ethnic kings, they were not just kings of a region, but they were Christian or Jewish or or Majusi kings, Zoroastrian kings of their time. So there was a heavily religious influence in a lot of the government of that time in that region. Now when talking about the governance within the Arabian Peninsula itself, Pan-Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula itself, then at that time it's very important to understand there was no centralized form of government. There were certain influences that were leaking into the Arabian Peninsula from the north, from the west, from the south. But primarily, this entire region was ruled by tribal law. The tribes were the law of the land. And what that meant, and again, these tribes were not centralized by any means. There were certain inter-tribal communications, but even inter-tribal relations were strained because of all the inter-tribal warfare that would exist. They were constantly at war with each other. Personal conflicts would often become tribal conflicts, which would contribute to a lack of governance within the region and the area. And so tribal law was the law of the land. Now, tribal law was, while it was different than kingship, but it had certain similarities, because the leaders of the tribe, the tribal leaders, the chieftains, were many times dictatorial type leaders. Their rulings would be accepted, would be enforced as a king's rulings, as a monarch's rulings, as a dictator's rulings. They could not be questioned, they were not questioned. And they were accepted regardless of anything else. And oftentimes this type of tribal leadership would pass down through the family like it occurs in monarchy. So it had certain similarities that it bore to kingship or monarchy, but nevertheless it was tribalism, and this was the law of the land, and this is how things existed at that time in that situation. And because of this type of a corrupt form of governance, one thing that I think we'll talk about more in terms of the culture of the land, or the culture of that time and that place and that region. But nevertheless, I'll go ahead and make mention of here, because still legal enforcement and preservations of people's rights are still related back to the politics of the region oftentimes. Because the political influences can many times dictate the type of enforcement or preservation you have of civil liberty, civil rights, and those types of things, as we know very well here today. So, similarly, because there was tribal law in the region, there was not a great preservation of people's rights. If you were wealthy, rich, influential, related to the tribal leaders, so if you had it in with the tribal leaders, if you had some type of a connection, or you had something to offer to the tribal leaders, then definitely you'd be alright, you'd be okay. But if you belong to any type of a demographic, any type of a class of society that was out of favor, or was irrelevant, or not of concern to the tribal leaders of that time, then again you would greatly suffer. You did not enjoy a lot of rights or even liberties at that time. And that was the way society was structured. Similarly, to talk specifically about the culture in terms of the rights that people enjoyed at that time in that area. At the same time, there's a very interesting dynamic. While we can say that the Arabian Peninsula, the area where the Prophet ﷺ was born and raised, that area was chaotic. It had no governance, it had no king, it had no rulers, it had no government. But there was another interesting dynamic. The Arabs who lived in regions that bordered the great kingdoms of those times, like I talked about Syria and Yemen and these different areas, they were oftentimes seen as inferior to the citizens of those kingdoms that they bordered. So while the kingdoms had an arm that extended within those regions and they were the primary governance within that region, the inhabitants of those regions were seen as inferior. They did not enjoy the same rights as the actual citizens. So the people that bordered the Syrian region, the great Syrian kingdom, Christian kingdom, right? Those Arabs, while they lived under that rule, they were seen as inferior. They were second-class, third-class citizens. They did not enjoy the rights that those actual Christians would enjoy. And the same thing goes for the Arabs that lived bordering other regions as well. But when you came into more of the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, the region of Al-Hijaz, where the Prophet ﷺ was born and raised, that area could be seen as chaotic, could be seen as, barbaric. They had no form of government. But at the same time, they were the envy of the other Arabs. They were the envy of the other Arabs. Why? Because they enjoyed complete autonomy. They lived on their own. They had no foreign influences. Nobody treated them as second or third class citizens. They enjoyed a lot of dignity and a lot of respect. So while it was a bit chaotic and things could get kind of dicey there sometimes, when tribes would go at war with each other, or when, if your cousin or your neighbor or your friend, got into a fight with the tribal leader's son, then he probably would die. All right? While there were incidents and situations of that nature, at the same time, this much had to be said, that there was a great honor of being from amongst these people, that you enjoyed complete freedom. You did not live under a foreign rule which designated you as a second, third, or fourth class citizen. And that was something very interesting that existed within Hijaz. And the rulers of Al-Hijaz, this is another thing that was very interesting, which you can see, again, could be designated as a contributing factor to why the Qur'an was revealed amongst these people, why the Prophet ﷺ was born amongst these people, was because the people of Hijaz had a different culture as well. They held their rulers in a great esteem. They didn't just see them as cultural, tribal, political, economic leaders, but they also saw them as religious leaders. They did not separate these concepts from each other. They saw them as religious leaders, and that's why the leader of the tribe of Quraysh, for instance, Banu Kinana, alright, the leader of the tribe himself, who would be the one making rulings, whose decision would be final in terms of where the trade caravan should go, and who would basically dictate the law of the land, he was also seen as a servant, as a caretaker, as a custodian of the sacred house of Al-Kaaba, as a custodian and the janitor of the haram. He was seen as such. And he would find it, and this was something that tribes actually fought over. Again, I don't want to get into this detailed history, but within the greater, the greater tribe that the Prophet ﷺ comes from, there was actually a war in between different groups, different families, if you will, within the greater tribe that the Prophet ﷺ came from. And they fought over who would get to take care of the Kaaba and who would get to serve water to the Hujjaj, to the people that would visit the sacred house. So you could see, while that same tribal leader that would sit there and give decisions and make rulings for the people, and would dictate rulings to the people, he was the same tribal leader that you would see out there walking around serving water, giving water to the people who were coming from far away to visit the sacred house. So there was a very interesting dynamic in this regard, and from there you can see a lot of the cultural roots, if you will, of the Islamic mode of conduct and behavior. You can see some of those cultural roots, cultural seeds, if not even roots, you can see the seeds of it there within pre-Islamic Arabia. Now to talk about the social life of the Arabs. What was the social life of the Arabs like? Arabian society was a very interesting mix of different social constructs that coexisted at one time. I'll talk about the negatives and then I'll talk about the positives. Some of the negatives that existed at that time was, again, you had a lack of, fair, equal treatment of all segments of society. Slavery was prevalent at that time. And not just any type of slavery, but slavery that treated their slaves in lesser, lesser than their animals. A camel, a horse, would enjoy better treatment than a slave would. Alright? So there was unequal treatment of people. The dynamic of women within pre-Islamic Arabian society was something that was very interesting. Again, everything was a mixed bag. You had two very, very different experiences of women within pre-Islamic Arabian society. You had on one side, women in certain social circles would be treated, again, unfortunately, very unfortunately, they would be treated subhuman, less than human. They were literally a commodity that would be passed on from man to man, from family to family. Alright, I'm not even going to delve in and talk about the moral constructs of that society. That'll be a different topic. So oftentimes when we talk about women, we also even talk about the sexual exploitation of women that existed at that time. I'm going to talk about that separately, because I feel that that is a separate dynamic altogether of that society, that how they even approached modesty and morals and ethics within their society. But I'm simply talking about how women were treated, just generally. So there was a segment of society, there were certain social circles where they were mistreated horribly, but there was also a segment of society, the more elite within society, like within the families of the tribal leaders, women held great esteem. Women held great esteem. That the women within these more elite families of Arabian society, they not only owned land, they owned great wealth and great money. Khadija al-Kubra radiallahu anha, the first wife of the Prophet ﷺ, is a perfect example of that, a great businesswoman, an extremely wealthy woman. But they even played a critical role many times within the politics of the region. Their opinions were very crucial and critical to a lot of policies that would be enacted, to major decisions that would be made at that time. Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, the daughter of Utbah, is a great example of this. That she dictated a lot of the, you could designate her as one of the key contributors to the Battle of Uhud. She was one of the key instigators of the entire Battle of Uhud. Alright, she was the primary opposition to Abu Sufyan, even at the time of Fathu Makkah, until she later accepted Islam. So women had a very interesting position. It almost depended on where this woman existed within Arabian society. So you had two opposite extremes at that time. So slaves suffered through a very horrible treatment. Women either enjoyed a great social status, and it's safe to say that they enjoyed much more freedom than women did in other parts of the world. But at the same time, similarly, unfortunately, they also suffered through some very horrible treatment at that time. So these were a few elements of the Arabian society of that time. As I talked about, leadership would be passed on within family, and money. At the same time, while money dictated to how well you would be treated, the money itself would be passed on through family as well. So it was definitely one of those dynamics that we still see today in third world countries, in third world society, in parts of the world, where a person has a very little chance of even trying to better their situation. If you're born into a bad situation, there's a very little chance of you even trying to better your situation. Because so many social obstructs exist that don't allow you. So many obstacles exist that they don't allow you to even move past or try to attain a situation better than your current one. Now to talk about the moral, ethical, culture that existed at that time. So we're literally talking about the culture of the Arabs. So in terms of modesty, in terms of the moral, ethical culture that existed, as I've talked about, if you committed wrong to someone who was of higher social status than you, you would probably be killed whether your crime warranted that or not. And if you committed wrong to somebody of a lesser social status than you, then you were probably going to get away with it. That's just how it worked at that time. Similarly, in terms of modesty, and this is not just simply a discussion of modesty, but even the situation of family. Because this would affect the family circumstances that existed at that time. So what was the family situation? Again, you had opposite extremes. Within the more elite of society, family held great esteem. Family was integral to the Arab experience, pre-Islamically. Alright? And marriage was something that was treated as something very sacred. A man would propose to a woman, and they would be married, and he would give a marriage gift. And he would take care of her, and he would treat her with a great amount of respect. He would respect her as his wife, as his partner in life, as the mother of his children. But there was also a segment of society, unfortunately, where it was the complete opposite. There's a hadith in the Sunan of Abu Dawood where Aisha radiallahu anha narrates from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that 4 kinds of marriage existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. The first was similar to present day marriage, meaning marriage within Islam. It was very similar to that. It was comparable to that. The second was, which I just described, the second was that a man, that sometimes a wife, basically, to summarize it, and because we are in a masjid and I like to try to keep it as clean as possible, that there was not a lot of, I'm trying to think of the correct word, it's right there in my head and it's escaping me. But basically, people did not treat marriage very sacredly. People would cheat on their spouses. There was a lack of, if somebody can think of the word, let me know. Fidelity. Infidelity was rampant within Arab society. So there was a segment of society where infidelity was a very common trend. And infidelity was almost expected. It was assumed. And spouses would many times know of each other's infidelity and have no problem with it. So unfortunately, that situation existed as well. The third type of marriage that Aisha radiallahu anha narrates from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that existed before Islam was that you had rampant fornication. Rampant fornication. That there was no marriage. In the second time there was at least a marriage, even though it was a sham of a marriage, but then infidelity was present. In the third kind there was just rampant fornication. And a woman would almost fornicate with a set group of men. And then whenever she would become pregnant, she would designate that child to be the child of one of those men. He would take that child as his own, and he would raise that child of his own. And so it was almost this very unfortunate type of communal fornication that was going on. The fourth type of marriage, which is not even the type of marriage, but that detail comes at the end of the hadith, was that there was just straight up what we know today as a form of prostitution. There was rampant promiscuity, to the extent of it being borderline prostitution. And that existed at that time. Where houses would be marked, residences would be marked, where this is where you would go to engage in fornication, adultery, and this is where you could come to attain the services of a prostitute. And children that would be born of these women would live a life of disgrace, because they would not be claimed by anyone. They would be literally labeled as children of a zina, waladu zina, awladu zina, and they would live a life of misery, and they would live a life of shame. And the Prophet ﷺ says that the latter 3 forms of marriage, if you will, the word marriage is being used because the word marriage within the Arabic language is nikah, which in its literal roots can literally mean to simply enjoy physical relations with a member of the opposite gender. Alright? So the Prophet ﷺ at the end of the hadith says these latter 3 forms of nikah were abolished by Islam, have been forbidden by Islam, do not exist or are not recognized after Islam, and only the first form of it remains and has been polished and made pristine by Islam, has been revered by Islam, and has been decreed as, the divine institution of marriage through Islam. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the situation, the circumstances of family and modesty and morals and ethics that existed pre-Islamically within Arabia. To continue on talking about the culture of the Arabs, and this is the last thing that I'll talk about here, is there was a very deep emotional attachment to family relations, which again is something that we know as an Islamic concept, Silat al-Rahim, keeping the bonds of kinship. All right, if anybody understands what that means. Basically keeping good with your family and your folks, right? Being good to your family and your relatives. This is an Islamic concept. This was something that was found amongst pre-Islamic Arabs. And again, the farther you went away from city life, the deeper you went into tribal life, nomad life, who are referred to even in the Quran as al-a'rab, the more you found this dynamic, the greater you found this experience. That family and tribe and relatives and relationships were very sacred. And they were maintained, and they were kept, and they were treated as sacred. Now talking about the economic situation. I've referred briefly about the economic situation. One thing that needs to be understood about the economic situation within pre-Islamic Arabia is that trade and business was the primary form of making a living. There was some farming that existed within some of the more central regions of Arabia, but nevertheless that was still a minority. That was still a rarity. The primary form of economics, the primary form of making a living, the entire economic structure of the pre-Islamic Arabs depended upon trade and business. And trade and business with outside regions. They didn't have a lot of natural resources. They did not enjoy many natural resources. So they would primarily focus on trading and doing business with outside regions. Taking goods from one border over to the other border. And this is basically how they made a living. And their entire economic system was based upon this. And again, because of the tribal instability, because of the political instability, their economics would often suffer. So the economic situation within pre-Islamic Arabia was not stable at all. And it's kind of like a vicious circle. Their political instability would make their economic situation very unstable. All right? And because of the economic situation being unstable, that would feed right back into political instability. So it was a very vicious circle. So basically these were people who would be involved in a lot of warfare. There was a lot of fighting constantly that was going on. And so poverty, hunger, these were very common trends found within pre-Islamic Arabia. And that's why, just like we see in the third world today, and in fact we even see this unfortunate trend growing here, but there literally was no middle class society within pre-Islamic Arabia. You had the very, very elite, and then you had the predominantly poor, which also constituted the majority of the land and the area. Now talking a little bit about some of the key vices, but also we talked about a lot of the vices and a lot of the instability that existed at that time. What I'd like to focus on now is what were some of the ethics, what were some of the positive elements of pre-Islamic Arabian society and their culture. Hospitality was one of their key qualities. And that might not sound like a big deal, like, okay, when somebody comes to your house and you're nice to them, right? Again, because of the culture that we live in today, hospitality is very minimal. Hospitality was a big part of the experience of pre-modern society. Because the second you traveled, you were instantly a guest. Alright? Any type of travel, any type of, instability within your own personal life immediately led to you being a guest. So hospitality was a big part of any culture. Alright, there were no hotels, there were no restaurants, there were no, grocery stores, and a lot of these types of conveniences that we have set up into place today, these things didn't exist. So you were immediately dependent upon somebody's hospitality, alright, and somebody's goodwill towards humanity in general. And hospitality was definitely a strong suit of these people. And it was almost, some of the historians say something very interesting. They say hospitality was so much of a quality of theirs that it was almost to a fault. That in the spirit of hospitality, they would commit wrong to another person. They would commit aggressions towards people in the pursuit of hospitality, that they would oftentimes jeopardize the well-being of their own family in the spirit of hospitality. Alright, and so this was how strong the sense of hospitality was within these people. And also, within the culture of hospitality, some very negative things, some certain vices existed within the culture of hospitality. Once again, because of rampant infidelity and promiscuity, that oftentimes they would offer up even their own spouses in terms of, in the spirit of hospitality. They would enlist the services of prostitutes in the spirit of hospitality. That wine, alcohol, drinking, unfortunately was very rampant, again, in the spirit of hospitality. Alright? That's so much so that the Arabs, the linguists, the etymologists, they note something very interesting, that karam, which means to be noble, to be dignified. And a good noble host would be referred to as kareem. And karam is also where the word for grapes comes from as well. A type of grapes also is extracted from that. While inab is bunches of grapes, alright? But karam is even makes reference to grapes themselves. Alright, because it was seen kind of hand in hand, and not just feeding of the grapes, so wine extracted from grapes would be served to one's guests as well. Another thing that was that was a great quality of the pre-Islamic Arabs was the sanctity of a person's word. When somebody gave you their word, that was it. They were people of their word. They held their word to be very, very sacred. Because again, in a place where there was no law, where there was no court, where there was no judge, where there was no legal system, a person's word was everything, was all that they had to offer. And especially because poverty being very rampant, sometimes when a person has nothing else to offer, when they can't pride themselves on anything else, they say, I got one thing left and that is my honor. And so that honor was very sacred in terms of my word. I gave him my word. And again, if I gave somebody my word that I would give this to them or I would provide to them, I would kill, I would murder, I would steal in order to keep my word. So there was a very interesting contradiction, but nevertheless, at least that spirit of keeping the word was something that was present amongst them. Sense of honor and repudiation of injustice. So they had a great sense of honor, and they, at least philosophically or conceptually, idealistically, they were opposed to injustice, even though injustice was rampant. But they were at least, they had this idea, they had this concept. And that's why we see that pre-Islamically, we see the Hilf al-Fudul. We see that treaty, that act being put into place, that treaty being enacted, that we will fight, we will strive, we will at least sit here and put our support behind preserving people's rights. And the Prophet ﷺ, that's why he was a part of the Hilf al-Fudul, and the Prophet ﷺ said that even after Islam, if this was brought to me again, I would agree to it, I would sign it, I would back it 100%, I would put my full backing behind it. Alright, so this was a concept that existed. As I mentioned before, forbearance, patience, almost mildness within a person's personality, composure, serenity. These were things that were greatly admired. Why? Because they were very hard to come by. These were very passionate people. Alright, they were very easy to get riled up, and so they respected these things. And simplicity was also a big part of their life. Simplicity. You had extravagance or lavishness that some elite of society would engage in, but there was still a great simplicity to these people. A leader would literally sacrifice his own animal, and he would skin the animal himself, and he would cook the food himself, and he would serve food to his people himself. And he found dignity and honor in that. He found dignity and honor in that. A leader would sit amongst his people, would walk amongst his people. When they would travel, the leader would literally sleep by the fire along with all the rest of the people. There were certain things that were very interesting about them, and they believed in certain simplicities that made their culture a very interesting culture, and gave certain very notable, there were certain notable ethics that were a part of that culture, which contributed definitely to the revelation of the Qur'an and the birth of the Prophet ﷺ amongst these people. Now, I'll end here today by talking about and then we'll talk about the religion of the Arabs in the next session, in the following week's session, inshallah. We'll talk about the religion of the Arabs, where their religion came from. There's a very interesting story, and there's a very interesting history to even where their religion came from, where it originated from, where it came from, all the perversions that it went through, and how it ended up in the situation that we find it at during the lifetime of at the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. And from there, of course, we'll delve into the actual birth of the Prophet ﷺ. I'll end by talking a lot about some of the cultural traditions that were a part of Arab life. The pre-Islamic Arabs in the area of Hijaz were predominantly illiterate, so much so that certain books of history say that all the literate people within Makkah were not even up to 20. There were not even 20 literate people who knew how to read and write fluently within the entire city of Makkah at the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. So illiteracy was that rampant. Alright, illiteracy was that rampant at the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ within Makkah. In spite of this though, the Arabs still placed a great premium on knowledge itself. So knowledge was carried primarily through oral tradition. Now again, you could see this almost kind of like a circular discussion. Part of the reason why they were illiterate was because these were people of great memory and great oral tradition. But again, because of their great oral tradition and their reliance upon memory, they never developed a sense of urgency about learning how to read and write. They never felt any need to learn how to read and write. So again, it was kind of like a vicious circle that just kept feeding into itself. But nevertheless, this was the culture of that time. But they still placed a great premium on knowledge. When certain people amongst them would travel out to other parts of the world and would bring back information in terms of astrology or economy or trade and business and agriculture and farming, or history, or even information on different religions, when they would bring back this knowledge, they would build circles, they would form circles around these individuals to get that knowledge directly from them. At the same time, genealogy was an expertise of these Arabs. It was something they were very keen on. The history of lineages, where people came from. A child by the age of 4 could literally recite his own genealogy, his own family tree, going 20 generations back, by the age of 4. And it was such an obsession amongst them, genealogy, they even preserved the genealogy of horses. They even would preserve the genealogy of horses, and because they were not literate people, they would memorize them. They would memorize the genealogy of horses. So genealogy was an expertise that existed amongst them, and it was a big science. It was a science. It was a knowledge that they prided themselves on. And of course, we know about the rhetoric, the eloquence, the oratory skills, the poetic skills of the Arabs, and how they prided themselves on this. And this was a big part of their culture and their society. Wars would be started. Like when I say wars, like battles would begin through displays of poetry and eloquence. They wouldn't send warriors out to the middle to first fight it out and then the battle would begin. They would send poets out to the middle to recite poetry to each other, praising their own people and degrading the others. That poetry was not just, it began wars, it would end wars. Tribes would one-up each other. They would have pride over each other based on how many poets came from their tribe. He's from our tribe, oh he's from my tribe, oh he's from their tribe. So tribes would pride each other based on their poets. Alright, and so their entire culture was founded on this. The tradition of Hajj that existed pre-Islamically, while it bore certain similarities to the Muslim practice of Hajj, the Islamic institution of Hajj, but nevertheless it was very different at the same time. And part of the difference was Hajj was a gathering when they would have poetry competitions. There was another occasion by the name of Ukaz, when all war, all battles, all differences would be put aside, and all the greatest poets of the land would gather in a place outside of Makkah, and there they would have poetry competitions. And the king of poetry for the year would be crowned at that time, the leader of poetry. Mr. Poet Man would be crowned at that time, and would be given his trophy until the following year at that time. So this was a big part of that culture and that tradition that existed at that time. And they prided themselves on this. Poetry was the law of the land. And This is a big reason for why the miracle that was the primary miracle, of course, that was given to the Prophet ﷺ was the Qur'an itself, and that's why the miracle was embedded within the guidance as a form of eloquence, because that was something that they definitely understood. And the Prophet ﷺ himself was an extremely eloquent man. He was not literate, which is something we'll talk about later. He was not a poet, but nevertheless, the Prophet ﷺ was an extremely eloquent man. And I forgot to mention this. We're going to talk next week about the religion of the Arabs, and we'll talk about the idols present within the Haram, around the Kaaba, placed in the Kaaba, around the Kaaba. Something else, they held the Kaaba as a sacred place. And you know what they would do with poetry? Whatever poetry was crowned to be the best poetry of that time, or that competition, would have the distinction, would have the honor of being hung from the Kaaba, or hung near the Kaaba. And they would be called the Al-Mu'allaqat. The poetry of Imra al-Qais, Zuhair ibn Abu Salma, they were hung there as the richest of poetry from the Arab tradition, and they would be called the Al-Mu'allaqat, the hung poems, and they would literally be hung near or around the Kaaba. And so these are some of the circumstances, both from all aspects: the geographical, the historical, the genealogical, the political, the economic, and even the cultural circumstances that were present at that time in the Arabian Peninsula, prior to the birth of the Prophet ﷺ amongst these people. We're nearing the time of Salat al-Isha now, inshallah, so we're going to go ahead and stop for this week. Next week we will talk about the religion of the Arabs. And that's going to have some very, very interesting details, because that is the key and the root of everything. And then the following week we'll talk about the birth of the Prophet ﷺ and how the Prophet ﷺ was able to change the tide, was able to counter all of these negative influences, and was literally able to restore this society, these people, to their original pristine of where they came from, Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that rich tradition, and how he was able to reverse the complete circumstances of these people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the understanding of everything that has been said and heard. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.
This audio is brought to you by Muslim Central. Please consider donating to help cover our running costs and future projects by visiting www.muslimcentral.com/donate.
You're listening to Qalam Institute's podcast. Visit us on the web at qalaminstitute.org and join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Qalam Institute.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing on our series talking about the Seerah, the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the prophetic biography. In the previous session, we talked about in detail about the situation and the circumstances of the Arab society before the Prophet ﷺ. And I explained the purpose of that. You can consider it a type of an introduction, but I think it's beyond an introduction. I think it's intricately and intimately connected to the actual study of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ himself, because you can only fully appreciate the work of the Prophet ﷺ and his accomplishments and his achievements and his sacrifices when you fully understand the full context of the time, the era, the culture, the economic condition, the politics, and even the religion of the people and the region and the time period in which the Prophet ﷺ was sent with this divine message and this divine responsibility of preaching the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to all of humanity and reintroducing mankind to Allah. So we talked about the social, political, cultural, economic conditions of pre-Islamic Arabian society. This week what we will primarily be talking about, because this is the thing that is the most directly connected to the study of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and that is we'll be talking about the religion of the Arabs before the Prophet ﷺ, the religion of pre-Arabian society and their religious condition and spiritual affairs. So one thing that needs to be understood is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Qur'an, actually in Surah Yasin, which was mid-Meccan revelation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet ﷺ, and I'll bring this up again towards the end of today's session. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet ﷺ, لِتُنذِرَ قَوْمًا, that you have been sent to warn a people. And I believe I explained the meaning of this, but the Prophet ﷺ is defined and described as being nadhir. Indhar. That was one of the key responsibilities, and in fact one of the very first things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet ﷺ to do, and that was indhar. قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ, stand up and warn. Alright, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, warn the closest of your family members and your tribes people. So, but what does it mean to warn? It wasn't just go and frighten them, go and scare them. But the meaning of indhar is to warn someone of imminent danger, to warn someone of some danger, to warn someone of some type of danger that is, to warn someone of something that is very dangerous and something that is approaching. Something that is of a realistic threat to the person, is a realistic threat to a person. And why are you warning that person? So kind of like if somebody's walking along a path and there's a ditch up ahead. So why are you warning this person of that ditch? Even, first of all, there's a ditch right on their path. So it's only a matter of time till that person falls in that ditch. Secondly, why are you warning that person? You're warning them out of sincere, honest compassion and concern for that person. So to warn someone of some imminent danger out of care, compassion, love, and concern for that person. That is the meaning of the word indhar, and the Prophet ﷺ was a nadhir. So Allah tells him, لِتُنذِرَ, we sent you so that you could warn. And you could watch out. You could tell these people to look out. قَوْمًا, a people, مَا أُنذِرَ آبَاؤُهُمْ, their forefathers had not been warned. No warning had come to their forefathers. فَهُمْ غَافِلُونَ. That's why you find these people so completely heedless. You find these people so completely careless about the message that you are presenting to them. So the Prophet ﷺ, he came at a time where guidance, revelation, the warning, the message had not come to these people for a very, very long time. They had been without any type of spiritual awareness for a very, very long period of time. Having said that, at the same time, to process and understand the history of these people and where they came from, monotheism, the worship of one Allah, the Prophet ﷺ was not the first one to bring this message to these people. This message had come to these people a long time ago through messengers like Hud alayhi salam, who came to the people of Ad, to the people of Thamud by Salih alayhi salam, Shu'aib alayhi salam. These were all messengers that had been sent to the Arabs, who are from the Arabs. At the same time, we know that Ibrahim alayhi salam had come and had settled his family there in that region, and that was the founding of that entire, the society that was present there. So Ismail alayhi salam and his followers and his children and his people were followers of the proper true message of the worship of one Allah. That existed, there's no doubt about that fact. But what happened was, after some time had passed, idolatry, the worshipping of idols, was introduced amongst this society. And one of the key people who introduced the worship of idols amongst this area, this region of Hijaz and the inhabitants of the city of Mecca, was a man by the name of Amr bin Luhay. Amr bin Luhay. He was the very first one to introduce this worship of idols amongst his people. He was a leader of his tribe, and he was also a traveler. He was a very cultured person, so he was very knowledgeable, he was very cultured, he was seen as a leader, and he was a traveler. He would travel wide, to all far different parts of the world, different societies and civilizations at that time. He ended up traveling to Syria, Bilad al-Sham. When he traveled to the region of Asham at that time, he found them worshipping certain idols. So what he did was he brought back an idol from there to his people and said, this is how the people of that area they worship. Alright, and they claim to be adherents and followers of previous prophets and good righteous people, just like we are, but they worship these idols. And I think it's a good idea for us. And he brings back this idol and brings it to his people, and his people, because he's a leader of his people, they look up to him, they follow him, they started worshipping this idol. Not only that, but from there, once it started to settle into the culture, the lives, the spirituality of these people, they kept making more and more idols. They kept bringing more and more idols from different parts of the world at that time. So much so, something very interesting, and this goes back to part of a historical gem from the Quran. this goes to uncovering a gem, a historical gem of the Quran, is that it's mentioned within the narrations, but actually a hadith of Bukhari tells us that Amr bin Luhay, he was led by a jinn. He was led by a jinn, a troublemaker. He was led by a jinn to the area that we know as current day Jeddah. And this jinn led him there and showed him where certain idols were buried. And he started digging there and he uncovered idols, 5 idols. He uncovered 5 idols. And these idols were the same idols that the followers of the people of Nuh alayhi salam used to worship. When Nuh alayhi salam came to his people and he told them, don't worship these idols, worship on Allah alone, there were 5 key idols that they used to worship. He dug up these 5 idols and brought them to his people and they started worshiping them. Alright, and what were these 5 idols? They are the same 5 idols that are mentioned by name in Surah Nur. They are the same 5 idols that are mentioned, by name in Surah Nur by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the people, they objected to Nuh alayhi salam. And they said, وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَتَكُمْ Don't stop worshipping your idols. Don't leave your idols. وَلَا تَذَرُنَّ And do not leave وَدًّا وَلَا سُبَاعًا وَلَا يَغُوثَ وَيَعُوقَ وَنَسْرًا Don't leave these idols. Don't stop worshipping these idols. And something very interesting, a question that some people pose, some people ask, is that why are these 5 idols mentioned by name? What is the relevance? Why mention them by name? What is the significance of their mention? Well, the significance of their mention is, number 1, that these are 5 idols that the Arabs used to actively worship. Alright? And these were uncovered very early on and were some of the key idols, some of the first idols that the Arabs, they started worshiping. Alright? Not only that, but something else very interesting. The reason why Allah mentions these 5 idols among all the hundreds of idols that were worshipped in Arabian society, and Allah mentions them here in Surah Nur, is because these 5 idols were uncovered by Amr bin Luhay. And he was told about these 5 idols by a jinn. And what is the next surah in the Quran that comes right after Surah Nur? It is Surah Al-Jinn. So because of that very, very beautiful connection, Allah mentions these 5 idols by name in the Quran, and then it tells us about the jinn. Nevertheless, this was exactly what was going on in Arabian society at that time. That you had an adherence, you had following of monotheism, the message of Ismail, and even the prophets before him, alayhimus salam. Later on, idolatry has now been introduced into the people of that time, of that area and that region, and they started worshipping idols. So idol worshipping, which is referred to oftentimes as paganism, alright, this type of pagan idol worshipping became widespread and literally became the predominant form of worship, spirituality of the people in that region. However, there were certain people at that time who held on to worshipping, or rather, before I go there, before I explain that, so idol worshipping was the predominant feature, was the primary mode of spirituality in that region and at that time before the Prophet ﷺ. Now what about the other religions? What about Christianity and Judaism? Because we know that the other major empires of that time were Christian and Jewish empires. Well, what about that? Well, what was going on with them? Did those religions ever play any type of a part? Did they ever have any presence within pre-Islamic Arabian society? So the answer is yes, but very, very minimally. Yes, they did play a part, they did have a presence, but a very, very small, minority, minimal presence. They were marginalized. I talked about in last week's session how some of the key kingdoms and empires that existed at that time, that were neighboring Arabian society at that time, they had major Christian and Jewish influences. But nevertheless, those were neighboring regions. But within the Arabian Peninsula, within the area, the region of Al-Hijaz, Christianity and Judaism played a very, very minor role. It only represented a very, very small minority within that region and within that area. For instance, you had very, very few Christianity for the most part was very scattered. You had neighboring regions like we talked about last time to the north, the kingdom of what is today what was classically referred to as Bilad al-Sham, and the Ghassanid Empire. The Ghassanid kings were present there, and they were pretty much an extension of the Roman Empire, so those were Christian influenced areas. You also had tribes of Jews, which we talked about last time, that had migrated to the interior part of the Arabian Peninsula, and they settled down and they settled their tribes there. And while they were very well established themselves for economic reasons and due to certain political and cultural influences, they had a very, very strong culture. And they, for the most part, they would isolate themselves culturally. They were not a missionary religion. They wouldn't actively preach and seek out converts and try to convert people to their religion. So that you had pockets of certain tribes that were Jewish that lived amongst them. But for the most part, they were, like I said earlier, they were mainly very, very isolated. And they didn't play a major part, nor did they find a great acceptance. People did not convert, mainly because that was not the primary motive of many of the Christian and Jewish people that lived at that time. However, at the same time, one thing that's very interesting that we find about the religion of the Arabs is that the worship of idols. All right, and one thing that needs to be understood is that within this idol worshipping of Arabian society at that time, even though they worshipped idols, they had a very strange structure of worshipping idols. They still worshipped and they still believed in Allah. And when I say that, that sounds very contradictory. No, but they still believed that Allah was the supreme God, was the supreme deity. And they acknowledged Him. And they believed in Him. And they even worshipped Him. What their compromise or what their perverse approach to religion was that they had all these idols erected, and they believed, as the Quran tells us, مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَا إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. We do not worship these idols except as connections, as intermediaries, as something and someone that connects us back to Allah. That's how we worship them. That's why we worship them. So they worship these idols. And they thought that each idol had its own influence. But they believed these idols to be intermediaries, to connect them back to Allah. That we only worship these idols to connect us back to Allah. And that's what they believed, or that's at least what they claimed. Alright? And something else that we find very interesting was the specific idols that they would worship. The idol that I named before, Wad, was worshipped by Banu Kalb bin Murrah. Suwa' was worshipped by the Banu Hudayl, which was at a place called Rihat, which was about a 3 days journey from Mecca. You had people worshipping the idol of Yaghuth, which was worshipped by Banu An'am, from the tribe of Atay. You had the idol Banu Khaywan, which was worshipped by the Hamdani people. You had the idol Nasr, which was worshipped by the Qabila of Dhil Kila', which was in the region of Himyar. So you had all these different idols being worshipped in these different regions and at these different parts of Arabian society at that time. Something else that was very interesting was there were certain idols that they saw as more important than these other little idols that they had. What they would do with these idols was they had established them at different parts of Arabian society at that time. And what they would do is they would not only worship them, but they would almost, if you will, construct like a mini Kaaba around them. They would consider these places to be other key, very important strategic places where they would worship these idols, almost as branches, satellite locations of the main Kaaba. All the idols would be gathered together in the Kaaba, but they would take a few idols, they would place them strategically around in different parts of Hijaz and different parts of Arabian society at that time, and they would consider them to be satellite locations for the Kaaba. For instance, Allah tells us in the Quran in Surah Al-Najm, which is very early revelation, Allah tells us, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ ثَالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى. That do you not see Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, and then Nawat, Al-Thalitha Al-Ukhra, the third Nawat. Alright? Well, Al-Lat was worshipped by the people of Thaqif at the place of Al-Ta'if. Uzza was worshipped at a region called Nakhla, which was very near Makkah itself. Manat was worshipped at the place of Yathrib by the tribes of Aus and Khazraj, which later on became Medina. At the same time, you had Dhul Khasla, which was another idol that was worshipped by the tribe of Ad-Daws. Alright? And that idol that was worshipped there, they had built a little place, a holy sanctuary around it, that they would call Al-Kaaba Al-Yamaniyah. Al-Kaaba Al-Yamaniyah. Alright? Similarly, there was a idol by the name of Falas, which was worshipped by the people of Tayyib. And again, they had built a sanctuary around it. There was another idol by the name of Ri'am, which was worshipped at the place of Himyar and by the people of Yemen. And again, they had built a sanctuary, a place of worship around it. Another idol by the name of Rada, which was worshipped by Banu Rabi'a. And yet there was another sanctuary, a place of worship, which was called Dhul Ka'bat. Dhul Ka'bat. Alright, which was worshipped by the people of Banu Bikr and Banu Taghlib. So what's very interesting is that these people started to indulge. The key point that I'm trying to make is these people were just not randomly worshipping idols. Alright? There was like this effort to replicate the same vibe, the same dynamic that existed, that was present in terms of the Kaaba. They knew the Kaaba in Mecca was very sacred. This was hallowed land, this was sacred land, it was a sacred place, it was a sacred construction, and this was a place where they worshipped the supreme being, the supreme God, Allah. But now you had them indulging into the worship of idols, where yes, they had hundreds of idols there within the Kaaba itself. There's a narration in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, which mentions that when the Prophet ﷺ came, at Fatih Makkah, the conquest of Makkah, there were over 360 idols present in the Kaaba at that time. So yes, they worshipped hundreds of other idols there within the Kaaba. They would have idols within their homes, that they would worship within their homes. But not just that, people of different regions, different tribes, had taken one of the larger idols, one of the bigger idols, one of the more important idols, like Lat and Uzza and Manat. Alright? They took these idols, they placed them there, and then they built a holy sanctuary around that idol. So it's like they were trying to replicate the same vibe of Al-Kaaba in different parts of their society at that time. And they would consider them as mini Kaaba, as satellite locations of the Kaaba. And there's even narrations in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad which mention the fact, and many of the books of Seerah talk about this fact, that they would even start to do tawaf around these places. So you see this slow perversion. It was like a deterioration of their spirituality, their religion. That, okay, first you worship Allah. Then they started taking idols. Then what they did was they developed bigger idols. So they didn't see these idols as supreme as Allah Himself, but nevertheless they were just a tier lower than them. So they started building second tier deities and gods. Not only that, but then they said, okay, for Allah you have the Kaaba as the key house of Allah. So what do we need to do? We need to build sanctuaries around these second tier gods. So they started building sanctuaries and said, okay, people journey to go visit the Kaaba, the Hajj, and people go there and do tawaf around the Kaaba. So what do we need to do? We need to replicate that. So now let's build a sanctuary. People in this region can visit these sanctuaries, and then they can also start to do tawaf and make different types of offerings to these sanctuaries as well. So you get this complete perversion, this complete spiritual decaying occurring within these people. A total, complete spiritual deterioration that was going on at that time in this society and among these people. At the same time, what started to happen was, whenever you have this type of a spiritual deterioration, complete spiritual decayance occurring amongst people, what you also have is, then their daily practices start to become affected. Then superstition and all types of other issues start to arise within these people. Evil omens, superstitions, alright, attaching of spiritual significance to different items and different things that are not warranted, that are not legitimate. That started to happen. And we know about this as well, that when the Prophet ﷺ came, because the Qur'an talks about this, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the Qur'an, He condemns this practice, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about things like bahira, sa'iba, wasila, inham, that these are practices that are not sanctioned, that are not legitimate, that should not be indulged in any way, shape or form. And what were these things? That Allah says in Surah, I believe it is in Surah Al-Ma'idah. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, in ayah number 103, Allah tells us about these things, that Allah has not sanctioned, Allah has not approved, Allah has not instituted. Alright, things like Bahira. What was Bahira? They would take a she-camel, and the milk of the she-camel was considered off limits. Nobody could drink, nobody could take, nobody could benefit from the milk of the she-camel, because the milk of the she-camel was solely designated, why? For the idols. All the milk that would come from the she-camel would be taken and would be presented to the idols as a form of an offering. This practice existed amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs. There was another practice of sa'iba. What was sa'iba? Sa'iba was a she-camel that would be let loose and nobody was allowed to touch it. You could not eat it, meaning you could not sacrifice it, you could not eat it. You could not ride it, you could not use it for transportation. It was marked. And that's it. This she-camel was to roam freely, and it was dedicated to the gods, to the idols. Nobody could touch it, nobody could benefit from it in any way, shape or form. Alright? There was another practice called wasila. What was wasila? Wasila would be a she-camel, alright, which again was set free for the idols, and this she-camel would be, or rather some of the historians tell us that the wasila would be the offspring of the sa'iba. So any she-camel that was a sa'iba that would breed and that would then have any type of children, any offspring, alright, that offspring would be dedicated as wasila. That was the offspring of a sacred she-camel, so they would be sacred automatically as well. And then there was ham. Ham was a male camel, alright, that would be used for any work that the idols needed. So you have to carry something to take it to the idols. Then you would use that specific camel. Or that male camel would also be used to breed with the sa'iba to give birth to the wasila. Basically, to summarize, they would take animals, they would mark them, and they would specify them solely for the service of the idols. Dedicate them to the idols. So these practices existed. These type of superstitious practices were existent, were present amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs. And we even have narrations, we even have a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ tells us that the very first one to institute a lot of these types of practices amongst the Arabs was the same person, Amr bin Luhay. He was the very first one to start practicing these things and bring these practices to the pre-Islamic Arabs. There's a hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad where the Prophet ﷺ says, أَوَّلُ مَنْ غَيَّرَ دِينَ إِسْمَاعِيل, that the very first person to alter, to change the deen of Ismail was that Amr bin Luhay individual. There are other narrations from the books of Seerah would say, فَنَصَّبَ الْأَوْثَانِ, he's the one that came and erected the idols for the people to start worshipping. وَبَحَرَ الْبَحِيرَةَ, he's the first one to designate a she-camel for the milk of the idols. وَسَيَّبَ الْسَائِبَ, he was the first one to mark a she-camel and say, this she-camel is designated for the gods. وَوَصَّلَ الْوَصِيلَ, he was the very first one to designate that any child, any offspring that will come from this camel will also be dedicated to the gods, to the idols. وَحَمَّ الْحَامِ, and he was also the first one to designate a male camel, again for the service and the breeding of the she-camels. Why? As an offering to the gods, to the idols. So all of these practices, unfortunately, were present amongst the Arabs in pre-Islamic Arabian society. Another very unfortunate practice that was a part of the religion of the Arabs before Islam, before the Prophet ﷺ was, when they had to make major decisions, they would basically gamble. They would chance. Gambling was a way that they would make decisions. They would launch arrows, they would shoot arrows, and they would maybe mark the arrows. This arrow is for this decision, that arrow is for that decision, and then they would shoot the arrows. Whichever arrow struck first or struck the target, that was a decision that the gods had made for us. Alright? Or they would take an arrow and they would launch it. And based on what direction it would go in or where it would land, where it would fall, based on that they would make a decision. Another superstitious practice amongst the Arabs, pre-Islamically, was that they would take a bird. And they would take a bird and they would fly it. Literally like release it. And based on what direction that bird would fly in, that would determine what the decision was, what needed to be done at that time. So if it goes right or it goes east, then this is what we need to do. If it goes west, then that's what we need to do. All right? These were all superstitious practices that were present at that time, among many, many different others. Among many different others. You know, one of the things I often explain in a course that I teach as well, is that the word al-Maghrib in the Arabic language comes from the root word gharb. Alright? Now what's interesting is that the root of the word means for something to vanish, something to disappear. Why is the direction of the west called al-Maghrib by the Arabs? Well, because the sun vanishes in the west, so they called it Maghrib, al-Gharb. Alright? Similarly though, what's very interesting is that a crow, the bird, the black bird, crow, in classical Arabic is called ghurab. Why is that bird called ghurab? From the root word which means to vanish? Well, because pre-Islamic Arabs, again, before the Prophet ﷺ, like many other different societies, alright, the crow has been the subject of much superstition throughout history. Many societies have been very superstitious about the crow. They see the crow as an evil omen, as a bringer of death. Alright, why? Because it's a scavenger bird. Alright, so whenever they would see a crow, they would think death is approaching. So the pre-Islamic Arabs are no different. When they would see a crow fly, they would consider it as a sign that death is coming. Alright? And they would attach superstitions or beliefs to this bird, the crow. And so because they thought that it was a bringer of death, it would bring death, they called it ghurab, vanish, disappear. Because they did not want death to come. So what I'm trying to explain is that there were a lot of superstitions. There was the worship of idols. There were pockets of Christianity and Judaism, all right. But even the Christianity and the Judaism of that time had become perverted, had lost its way. We know that the Quran tells us, يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَمْ مَوَاضِعِهِ وَنَسُوا حَظًّا مِمَّا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ. All right. It tells us about the rabbis. All right, the spiritual leaders amongst Jewish society at that time, that what they would do is that they would alter the tradition. They would change words from places. They would alter the tradition. And they would distort the teachings of their religion. Alright? And that there was a lot of corruption. That they basically put the Torah aside and they themselves became the source of the religion for their people. Alright? And we even find, even if you go and you talk to people of the Jewish tradition, people that are well schooled within that tradition, they'll tell you that rabbinical law is the supreme source of law within their tradition. The Torah is almost looked on as with a type of spiritual reverence. It just has a symbolic, it has a symbolic type of sacredness. It's very symbolic, it has a certain sacredness, but it's almost just looked back at as a source of inspiration. But the law is rabbinical law. It is decreed, it is decided by the rabbis. Alright, and this is something that the Quran talks about that was present at that time. The Christianity at that time had also been widely affected. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, لَقَدْ كَفْرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَةٍ إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ وَلَا تَقُولُوا ثَلَاثَةٍ. The Quran was addressing it at that time, that the majority of even Christians at that time had fallen into this predicament of worshipping Isa alayhi salam and believing in the Trinity. So even the pockets of Christianity and Judaism that existed within Arabia at that time had been perverted. They were not the original teachings of Musa and Isa alayhi salam, but they had been perverted. They had been changed. Alright, they had been altered, distorted. Secondly, the majority of the people at that time worshipped idols. But it wasn't just simple as worshipping idols. No. They saw these idols, they had a very weird compromise, which justified their behavior to themselves. They said, look, we know that we come from a tradition that tells us to worship one God, Allah. Okay, fine, we're okay with that. Why? Because we haven't let go of Allah. We still worship Allah. We still believe in Allah. And that's why when they would be asked who created the heavens and the earth, لَيَقُولُونَ اللَّهِ. They'll say Allah. But then what happened was, they introduced these idols as dignitaries, as intermediaries, as representatives of Allah, who have been put in charge of different things, different issues. Alright, whether it be rainfall, or it be childbearing, getting offspring, having children, or whatever, or the crops, and whatever else it might be. So these different idols are in charge of these different things, and Allah, God Himself, the Supreme Being, has put them in charge of these things. So they're still worthy of veneration and worship and offering and devotion, dedication, as a channel to God. Alright, this was the perverted belief that the very unfortunate justification that they present, the compromise that they had. But the problem with that was these idols eventually became the object of their sole devotion, dedication. They completely forgot about Allah after a certain time. And that's why in another place in the Quran though, when it tells you, when it asks, when it tells the Prophet ﷺ to pose a question to them, alright, that who is the one that gives you everything that you have? Who is the one that gives you, who is the source of all the blessing you have in your life? Then at that time the answer is being fed that tell them it should be Allah, it should be Allah, it should be Allah. Because after a certain point in time, they became completely disconnected. The object became the idols themselves, which were only supposed to be the means. And even that was incorrect. But their own compromise was their own doom. Their own compromise did them in. And that was the problem. Alright? So that practice existed. But not only that, but then they indulged within that practice. What did they do? They said, okay, then they took some of these idols and they said, these are bigger idols. These are bigger idols. These need to be second tier gods. So they started indulging into it. And then what do we need to do? We need to take these second tier gods, and just like for Allah we have the Kaaba, we need to designate sacred places of worship where people can go and visit and do tawaf and do all the things like I explained. And that's why they would refer to, many of the Arabs that lived in these other places, they would refer to the Kaaba in Makkah as Al-Kaaba Al-Shamiyah. Al-Kaaba Al-Shamiyah. That is the Syrian Kaaba. That is the Kaaba that is in the direction of Asham. Why? Because the Kaaba in the direction of Al-Yaman was different. Al-Kaaba Al-Yamaniyah. And so they started indulging, engaging in all these different practices. And then you had all these superstition. Then superstition completely took over their day-to-day lives. And they started, even making decisions based on superstition. Where does an arrow go? What arrow strikes first? Which direction did the bird fly in? They started doing that. They started taking their money and their wealth. They would take camels and designate them for the gods. They would go and they would make offering to the gods. Alright? Not only that, but then people capitalize on this, right? I'm trying to show you how prevalent this became in society and how it began to completely infiltrate every aspect of their lives. Whenever you have this type of a corrupt practice, then you also have people who will exploit it for their own personal gain. Alright, and you had that same thing at that time as well. You had people that would then be like soothsayers, kuhan, arraf. You would have a kahin, you would have an arraf. Alright, and what would these people do? These would be people that would, claim to know what the will of the gods was. And they would claim to have certain little tricks, certain things that they would read, whether they would read the stars like an arraf, or they would read, some of your personal situations, or they would read certain incantations, and they would know what you should do, or they would make recommendations to you, or they would bless you on behalf of the idols and the gods, like a kahin, a soothsayer. And these practices were very prevalent in the time of the Arab. And that's why when the Prophet ﷺ first came with his message, one of the very first reactions was what? That he is a kahin, he's a soothsayer. He reads the stars. Right? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا بِقَوْلِ كَاهِن. The Quran is not the word of a kahin. The Prophet ﷺ is not a kahin. Alright? And so that was also very, very prevalent. So when anybody would need anything, would need to decide anything, would want to be blessed, was dealing with a situation or some circumstances, they would right away go to these people. So you had people exploiting this now, false belief of the people, and taking advantage of the people as well. Not only that, and one other thing that I didn't mention was, and this wasn't a majority, this actually never caught on. This was present in other parts of the world at that time. This never caught on in Arabian society, but you also had a very small pocket, a very small minority, which was hooked on astrology. not astronomy. Astronomy is just a science of everything Allah's created. All right, how far is the moon from the earth and the sun and the stars and the planets? Not that, but astrology, like a manifestation of it that exists till today is like horoscopes. All right, horoscopes are a manifestation, reading of the zodiacal signs and things like that. All right, that is a manifestation of astrology in our time. And I know pretty much it's now at this point in time it's just seen as something that is either something that people indulge in for entertainment, or either more simple-minded of society who go to a palm reader and things like that. But nevertheless, some people do take this very seriously, and it contradicts and it affects a lot of people's beliefs even till today. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ told us to be careful about this as well. And the Prophet ﷺ said that man ata kahina, or the Prophet ﷺ said, man ata arrafan, that whoever goes to these types of people who read the stars or indulge in soothsaying and things like that, then that person, فَقَدْ كَفَرَ بِمَا جَاءَ Muhammad, then that person has disbelieved in that which Muhammad ﷺ came with. He's disbelieved in Islam. So there's one particular thing that's noted about the pre-Islamic history, is that among the Arabs you had a man, he was widely known as Abu Kabsha. Abu Kabsha. This man had traveled to other parts of the world, and he had found them trying to read the stars and engaging in astrology and things like that. He had found these people adhering to these things and believing in these things. So he had brought back this knowledge or this information, he brought it back to the Arabs. And he tried to present it to them. That worship the stars. Particularly there was one star that he was advocating the worship of in pre-Islamic Arabian society by the name of a Seerah. He said that there's one big star that everybody worships that is called a Seerah. We worship that star, and based on the pattern of the star and the visibility of the stars and things like that, and whatever constellations are visible at different times of the year, then based on that we will make our decisions, and that will be the will of the gods. All right? But what ended up happening was that the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, never accepted him. And they never accepted this type of worship and this type of belief system that he was presenting to them. So for the vast majority of people, he was just dismissed as a crazy person, and what he was presenting was not accepted. And when the Prophet ﷺ came, when the Prophet ﷺ brought his message, one of the very first early accusations against the Prophet ﷺ was that some of the people in Mecca, they referred to the Prophet ﷺ as Ibn Abi Kabsha. Ibn Abi Kabsha, he is the son of Abu Kabsha. Why? Because just like he was telling them, stop worshipping all these idols and worship the one supreme being who happens to be a star, a Seerah, which was incorrect, completely incorrect. But when the Prophet ﷺ said, stop worshipping all these idols and the sun and the stars and everything, all right, because you also had pockets in Arabian society that would worship the suns, what they learned from the Majusis, the Zoroastrians in Persia. All right, so when the Prophet ﷺ said stop worshipping everyone and everything and worship one Allah alone, they said, oh, Ibn Abi Kabsha, you're the son of Abu Kabsha. You're just like that guy. He wanted us to not worship our idols and worship samsar, so similarly you just want us to worship your God. Alright? But to refute that claim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Najm, وَأَنَّهُ هُوَ رَبُّ الشِّعْرَى وَأَنَّهُ هُوَ رَبُّ الشِّعْرَى. That's why Allah says that, no, you got it all wrong. Allah is the Rabb of a Seerah. Allah is the Rabb of Seerah. That Muhammad ﷺ doesn't tell you to worship a star called Seerah. Muhammad ﷺ is the one who tells you to worship Allah. And who is Allah? Allah is the Rabb. Allah is the creator of that star that some people unfortunately and very wrongfully they worship. They incorrectly worship. Alright? So that was also one of the accusations against the Prophet ﷺ because of this individual who had tried to bring the worship of a star and tried to bring astrology to the Arabs, which they had dismissed and that they had not accepted. So this was, for the most part, this pretty much summarizes the method of worship in pre-Islamic Arabian society. This so far has explained everything wrong that they did. But like I did in the previous session, I also want to highlight what were some remnants. What were some remnants? What were some things that were left over from the practice or the teachings of the prophets of the past that were still present within pre-Islamic Arabian society? That when the Prophet ﷺ brought the proper message to them, there were a few things that they were still doing correctly. There were a few things that they were still doing right. So one of those things was, of course, like I mentioned, this very perverse, this very twisted understanding of how their idols at the end of the day were not the ones who were finally, solely in charge, but that their idols answered back to Allah. Alright, so this was that very twisted mentality that they had. But you see that it is some form of a remnant of the earlier teachings of the Prophet and the Prophets. Now, what was another remnant? Another remnant was that the Kaaba, the holy sanctuary, the Kaaba, they still saw it to be a very sacred place. And even though they still, again, had that twisted practice where they built mini Kaaba, satellite locations for the Kaaba, in different parts of their society, their area, their region, nevertheless, they still saw the Kaaba to be the supreme. Alright, this was the original house of God. They still saw it as such. And they worshipped, and they visited, they venerated it, they devoted themselves to it, and they respected it as such. Alright? And that's why they would still make the pilgrimage, they would still do the Hajj. Alright? And they would visit it, and they would visit the other sacred regions around it, like Mina, like Arafah. They would still go and stand in Arafah. They would still go and sleep over in Mina and Muzdalifah. They would still go and visit these places. And they would still observe a type of Hajj. It was a completely distorted form of the Hajj, but nevertheless, these were still some remnants that were left over. They still saw Safa and Marwa as being sacred places. They still thought that the well of Zamzam, there was something special about it. They still venerated the place, the maqam of Ibrahim. They still respected the Al-Hajr al-Aswad and would kiss it, alright, for blessing. So these were still some of the remnants that existed, that stayed with them. Alright? And they would do tawaf around the Kaaba. But again, as was the case with so many other things, they twisted it. They would twist it. And how did they twist it? That it's mentioned that they saw it to be such a sacred place, that if you were not from the Quraysh, there was something filthy about you. There was something filthy about you if you're not from the Quraysh. So what did you have to do? When you would come to the Kaaba, when you would visit the Kaaba and you would want to worship the Kaaba, or worship at the Kaaba I should say, alright, what you had to do was you would either have to purchase some of the clothing of the Quraysh. You would have to adorn yourself in the clothing, the libas of the Quraysh. And so obviously now what happened was, that for the Quraysh, that became an opportunity to make some money. Alright, they got to buy our clothes. Let's cash in. So now what they would do is they would sell clothing to these people, the pilgrims, the visitors. And they would charge them exorbitant amounts of money. Alright? And if people could not afford, what was the other option? So that's what you find in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. It's mentioned that very unfortunately, people pre-Islamically would do tawaf at the Kaaba nude, without any clothing on. Because if you could not purchase the clean clothing of the Quraysh, then what you would have to do is you would have to do it nude and naked. But you couldn't wear your dirty clothing. Alright, and so that's another thing they would do. The Quran tells us, وَمَا كَانَ صَلَاتُهُمْ عِنْدَ الْبَيْتِ إِلَّا مُكَاءً وَتَصْدِيًا. And then when they did, however they would do it, either in the clothing of the Quraysh or without any clothing, then how would they do the tawaf? Muka'an, whistling, tasdiyatan, clapping. They would whistle and clap as they went around the Kaaba, and this was their form of ibadah, worship, salah. Like we make dhikr and dua when we do tawaf today. Alright? What they would do is they would whistle and clap. Alright? So you had remnants, but they would twist everything. Everything was twisted. When they would go and stand in Arafat, same thing they would do. They would remove all their clothing to present themselves. Like we go in ihram. Alright? They would go in the Arafah and they would stand before the gods to ask and to pray and to worship. But what would they do? They would remove their clothing and they would stand naked. They would stand nude in Arafah. Alright? So you had a lot of these very unfortunate twisted practices. Alright? But serving the Kaaba, cleaning it, taking care of it, giving water to the Hujjaj, these were things that stayed with them. These were remnants. Alright? These were remnants. And they stayed with them and they saw a lot of virtue in this. But even then they would twist this. How would they twist it? There would be wars to decide who would clean the Kaaba. There would be wars to decide who would give water to the Hujjaj. Within families, there were civil wars within families, within tribes. And heads of different families within the tribe had fought each other for generations for the right to be able to give water to the Hujjaj, or the right to be able to clean and be caretakers of the Kaaba. Alright, so there was a lot of twisting of these different practices. So even the good that remained with them, there was still a problem with it. Alright? Another thing that was very problematic amongst them at that time, in terms of this adherence to some form of the original tradition and religion, but then of course it was a twisted, perverted form of it, was that the Quraysh, this is what gave prominence to the Quraysh in Arabian society at that time. Because the Quraysh were the inhabitants of Mecca, because they were the caretakers of the Kaaba, because they were the people who gave water to the Hujjaj, the Quraysh held a very special place, like of leadership and of reverence among all the other Arab tribes. The Quraysh were seen as a supreme tribe because they were in control of the Kaaba. They were the ones who lived in Mecca, and they're the ones who gave water to the Hujjaj, and they were the hosts of all the Hujjaj. Alright, and all the rites of Hajj at that time, so they were seen as superior. Alright, so there wasn't a centralized form of government, but if there was anything that was as close to as possible as a central form of government, then it was the Quraysh. Because of these advantages, alright, that they had in that society and at that time, amongst those people at that time. Now the last thing that I wanted to talk about here, in terms of the religion of the pre-Islamic Arabs, the last thing I wanted to touch upon here is, what role did religion play in their lives? That's one thing. So now you understand what their religion was, how they went about in their religious and spiritual practices and routines, and what it exactly involves, and how it was corrupted. But now overall, what role did religion play in their lives? And what I mean by that is something that we can talk about. We're very, very familiar with. Like for instance, we live in a widely agnostic society today, where religion is seen as something to a lot of people. To some people, I should say rather, religion is still something sacred, it's still something important, it's still something that makes up a part of their identity. But it is mostly marginalized when you talk about overall how people live their lives. It doesn't play a major role and a major factor. In fact, that's part of the political scene right now. Alright, that's part of the political scene. You have some people who think religion should play a very major role in politics and in running of government and in running of people's lives and society and culture. And then you have a lot of people who think that should not be the case. And that's part of the struggle politically that we see going on in our country right now. And as Muslims, we know that religion is something that dictates everything to us in our lives today. Religion is what dictates our culture to us, our family life to us, our economic policy to us. Alright, so how we manage our finances, to how we live our lives, and how we conduct ourselves at home, and how we raise our families, our deen is central to everything. Alright, so it's different perspectives. So what was the role of religion, spirituality, religion, in pre-Islamic Arabian society? So in pre-Islamic Arabian society, it was completely marginalized. It had a form of like a sacredness, a symbolic sacredness. Alright, it was very symbolic, alright, and it had a certain sacredness. But the reason why I say it was marginalized was there were certain places, certain things within their lives. For instance, if a battle and a war is going on, this is talked about in Surah At-Tawbah, إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ. Nasi, the practice of nasi'un. Alright, إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ. What that means is that there were certain things within their religion that would dictate major parts of their lives. Alright? For instance, if there was warfare going on, two tribes are at war with each other. And there were certain sacred months. There were certain sacred months. And if one of the sacred months arrived, and there were two tribes that are at war with each other, they were not allowed to fight during the sacred months. Now that's a problem. But the reason why I say the religion was marginalized, what they would do is they'd say, all right, we got a solution here. The war is raging on, and this tribe is right about to crush the other tribe, and the war's about to be over, but now the sacred month is arriving tomorrow, or in a couple of days, and we got to stop the fighting. But we don't want the fighting to stop, because the people that we'd like to win the war, have the upper hand right now. So what are we going to do? This is what we'll do. We're going to delay the month. We're going to delay the month. So let me use English months, just the solar calendar, the months that we use. Let me just use that as an example so that people don't get lost in the example, in the analogy. All right. So let's just say, for example's sake, October is a sacred month. Battle's going on right now. We're about to win the battle, but October's about to be here in a week or in 4 days. That's a problem. If we can push right through, in about 2 weeks, we should have this wrapped up. So what we're going to do is we're going to delay October. And we're going to bring November forward, because November is not a sacred month. So we're going to bring November forward. We're going to go ahead and have November first. And then once we wrap up the battle, because we should have it wrapped up in about 2 weeks, then we will mark and celebrate and observe October afterwards. But when next year comes around, we'll put it back into its place. Well, what happens? The battle goes for 6 weeks, not 2 weeks. So what do we got to do? Okay, no problem, we got this under control. The problem is that December is a sacred month as well. But January is not. So we brought November forward and put October behind. Now we'll go ahead and we'll bring January forward and we'll put December back. So let's have October, let's have January, then we'll have November, and then we'll have December. It's a complete disaster. Alright? And when the next year comes around, then nobody can remember. Did we forward December, January, or was it not? And after a certain point in time, it's a complete disaster. That's just one example of how religion was marginalized, where they still allowed it a certain symbolic sacredness, but they would very conveniently switch it around and move it around if they had to, in order to get what they wanted, in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve. All right, and that's the role of religion in pre-Islamic Arabian society. It was marginalized. It was symbolic at best. That's all it was. It was very ceremonial. It was very ritual and symbolic at best. And for a lot of people, it wasn't even that anymore. That was even for more cultured amongst society. Leadership. Because why? Because the religion, being able to be the figureheads of religion is what allowed them to maintain their control. So they're the ones who would even be concerned about this stuff even at a very ceremonial level, at a very symbolic level. But the vast majority of people at that time, like we see in a lot of societies even today, they didn't even care. It wasn't even a consideration. And that was the practical role of religion in pre-Islamic Arabian society. All right? And I've pulled here a couple of narrations, which are just, which are a great example of how, even that symbolic ceremonial form of the religion, how even that was a complete and total joke. It was a travesty. I give you that one example of the switching of the calendar. I pulled a couple of narrations here, which really, really, established this fact that it was a travesty, it was a joke, it was a mockery of a religion. All right? There's a narration which tells us that there was a man by the name, in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, this is from the Musnad of Ahmad, a man by the name of As-Sa'ib bin Abdullah. As-Sa'ib bin Abdullah. This man had carved an idol. What he would do, and this was the idol that his family and his tribe and his people would worship, and he had carved it, and he was responsible for it, he was in charge of it. What he would like to do in order to honor this idol is he would go to those camels that were dedicated, their milk was dedicated to the idols. He would go and he would milk those camels, those she camels. He would bring this milk that was sacred milk for the idol now. And what he would do is he would come and he would pour this milk onto the idol. He would pour that milk on the idol as an offering to the idol. So he would come and he would pour all this milk. So you had all these she-camels running around that were sacred. Nobody could use their milk. So you'd have to milk them though. He would bring all this milk and he would pour it. Every day he would come and he would pour milk all over the idol and rub milk on the idol as an offering to the idol. The narration of Musnad Ahmad says that what would then happen later at night, after everybody went home, was that dogs would come. And when dogs would come and they would lick the idol because of the milk that was on the idol. They would come and they would lick the idol every single day. And whatever milk was left over, they would place it there in front of the idol. So the dogs would come, they would drink the milk and they would lick the idol. And then after drinking all that milk and licking the idol, when they would have to urinate, then they would urinate on the idol. They would urinate on the idol. This was seen by people. This was observed by people in this narration in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah. That this was what a travesty, even their completely bogus form of religion, even how it was a complete mockery and a joke to them even. Even they made a joke out of the joke of a religion that they had. It was nothing. Alright, there's another very interesting narration which is mentioned in the books of Seerah. There was a tribe by the name of Banu Hanifa. Banu Hanifa. Alright, which was a tribe at that time. Well, this tribe, they made an idol out of hais. They made an idol out of hais. Hais is the name of a type of sweet that people would eat at that time. Kind of like what we would call halwa. Alright, it was a type of halwa, a type of sweet, a type of, cake, if you will. Alright, for our context, it was like a cake. It was a type of cake. So what they did was they carved an idol out of cake. Alright, they carved an idol out of cake, out of type of halwa at that time. And so this was their tradition. So what they would do is they would carve it, they would build this big beautiful idol out of cake or sweet or whatever that was made out of dates and the fat of animals, and they would put some milk in there, and they would make this big old idol. Alright? And they would worship it for quite some time until it would go bad or it would start to rot or the insects would eat away at it or whatever, then they would build another one. So they built this idol out of this cake, if you will. And then what happened was a drought hit their region. A drought hit their region. And those people eventually got so hungry and such severe starvation came to them that they eventually went and ate that idol that they had made out of all this dates and food and cake and sweets and everything, that's idol that they had constructed. They went there and they ate it. And somebody, a poet who was there at that time, saw these people doing this. He saw them eating their idol. And he said in a couple of poets, in couplets in a poem, he said, أكلت حنيفة ربها زمن التقحم والمجاعة لم يحذروا من ربهم سوء العواقب واتباعه. He said that the people of Hanifa, they ate their Rabb, they ate their Lord. In a time of severe starvation and drought, they were not afraid of their Lord. How horrible of a followers were these people, and how horrible and how pathetic of a Rabb did they worship. Like how pathetic was that which they worshipped, and how pathetic of followers were these people, that their Rabb did not even strike that much fear into their hearts that they had no problem going and eating Him. And how pathetic of followers were these people that they would actually go and eat that which they worshipped. But that was the role of religion. That was literally the status of spirituality at the time before the Prophet ﷺ. I want you to understand that. I want you to fully grasp that. Because when you grasp that, when you understand that, just a complete spiritual, decaying that had occurred, the total spiritual deterioration that had occurred at that time, then and only then can you fully appreciate who the Prophet ﷺ was and what he was able to achieve and accomplish. That he raised, he trained, he taught the ultimate generation of Muslims and believers and mu'minun and muwahhidun. The greatest people to ever walk this earth. People that Allah says about them, رِجَالٌ صَدَقُوا مَا عَاهَدُوا اللَّهَ عَلَيْهِ. People who fulfilled their promise to Allah, their covenant with God. Men, people, a society that fulfilled the covenant that they had with God. That how those people were originally these type of people, these same people. These same people. Alright? Then and only then can you fully appreciate that. And I wanted to talk here at the very end in just a couple of minutes about how was this even accomplished? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as rahmatul lil alameen. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was able to accomplish this by inspiring people. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't just show up and start talking, completely bad about their idols. Yes, he said this is wrong. But he didn't just show up and, completely trash them. That wasn't the method, but he inspired them. He motivated them. He won them over. As Hassan bin Thabit said about the Prophet ﷺ, وَأَحْسَنَ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَرَقَتُّ عَيْنِي وَأَجْمَلَ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَلِدِ النِّسَاءُ خُلِقْتَ مُبَرَّأً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ كَأَنَّكَ قَدْ خُلِقْتَ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. He says that, and more excellent than you, my eyes have never seen such a man. My eyes have never seen anyone more amazing than you. And no woman has ever given birth to anyone more beautiful and amazing than you. خُلِقْتَ مُبَرَّأً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ. He said, you were created free from any shortcomings and faults. كَأَنَّكَ قَدْ خُلِقْتَ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. It's as if you were created as you desired, as you would have wanted. It's like Allah made you custom, made you by demand. You were created customized. And that's how the Prophet ﷺ inspired people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بُرْهَانٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكُمْ نُورًا مُبِينًا. That a very clear proof and evidence came to you from your Lord, and not just that, but Allah revealed to you a nur, a light. This was a time of complete darkness. This was a time of complete darkness. Complete darkness. Alright, there was no nur, there was no enlightenment of the heart, illumination of the heart that existed at this time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet ﷺ as what? And this Quran, the divine message, and the presenter of this divine message, Muhammadur Rasulullah ﷺ. Allah sent it as a nur that was mubeen. A nur that would spread, a nur that was clarifying, a nur that would make sense and clarify and spread this light to the hearts of people. The Prophet ﷺ, that's why he's referred to in the Quran as Sirajan Muniran. A lamp, a lantern whose light spreads. It glows and it catches on to others. And the Prophet ﷺ was sent to inspire people. وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَاعْتَصَمُوا بِهِ فَسَيُدْخِلُهُمْ فِي رَحْمَةٍ مِّنْهِ وَفَضْلٍ وَيَهْدِيهِمْ إِلَيْهِ صِرَاطًا مُسْتَقِيمًا. It was a mercy, it was a blessing from Allah, and it guided people onto the straight path. فَقَالْ, and like the people said, like the people would say to Nuh alayhi salam and to other prophets before them, مَا هَذَا إِلَّا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ يُرِيدُ أَن يَتَفَضَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ. That he's just a man who just wants to prove himself to be superior to you. But that wasn't the case. The Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was a nur, was a light. He enlightened people, he inspired people, he motivated people. And he presented to them the Quran, which was a nur of the hearts. And it inspired, enlightened people. It changed people from the inside out. And that's why the first introduction was to Allah. Who is Allah? How amazing is Allah? And the first introduction to the Prophet ﷺ was what? إِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. It was the character of the Prophet ﷺ. This was, in the opinion of many of the scholars of the Quran, this was the second revelation. It wasn't just the knowledge. It just wasn't talk, but it was that khuluq and that akhlaq. Coupled with the Quran, which changed the hearts of the people, which inspired the people, and allowed the people to better themselves. So we'll go ahead and inshallah stop here for today. This was a very thorough discussion on the religion, the role of religion, and even the religion that was present before Islam in pre-Islamic Arabian society. Next week what we will talk about is, we will talk really briefly about the Hunafa. There were literally a handful of people. There was literally a handful of people you could count on one hand. At the most, like 7, 8 names are mentioned in the books of history that were present at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ was born, there were literally a handful of people, half a dozen people who worshipped properly. So we're still worshipping one Allah. We'll talk a little bit about them, and then we will talk about the year in which the Prophet ﷺ was born, the year of the elephant, and that entire incident and situation, scenario, what exactly transpired, what happened. And then we'll start talking about the family of the Prophet ﷺ, the family background of the Prophet ﷺ. And then inshallah the week after that we will actually go to talking about the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, and we'll begin his actual life from there inshallah. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us a proper understanding and realization of who the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to develop love for the Messenger of Allah and allow to follow in his footsteps and his ultimate example, and by means of that become beloved to Allah. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.
Mm-hmm.